Thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. I want to particularly thank Professor Hebel Shazli, who I think had the initial idea to invite me to kind of give a talk that would provide me with an opportunity, as I saw it, and to kind of actually force me to reflect a bit on my 2 stints of service in the Obama administration, and to talk about some of the work that I was doing and what I learned from it, and to kind of look more broadly at some questions and challenges that we may be facing with respect to Islam and Muslim communities around the world, as well as in the United States, with the advent of the new administration in Washington, D.C. I served in the Obama administration on 2 occasions. In 2011 and 2012, I was a member of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's policy planning staff during the Arab Uprisings, those momentous dramatic events that captured all of our imaginations, I think, starting in late 2010 and running well into 2011, marked by popular revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, the beginning of protests that eventually evolved into the civil war that we have in Syria today, but upheaval and popular people power expressing itself on the streets in countries as diverse as Bahrain and Morocco as well. And as many of you know, in the immediate aftermath of those revolutions, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia, the immediate political beneficiaries of those events tended to be Islamist political parties and movements, more specifically the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Nahda party in Tunisia. And I was brought in specifically to the State Department to help craft the contours of a new U.S. policy towards Islamist political movements and parties, I think with the understanding that our policies in that regard were perhaps somewhat out of date. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about why that was the case and what that meant. So I was there for a little over a year, and then I came back to Mason, and then in the aftermath of the equally dramatic, and I think also deeply tragic, rise of Daesh, of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria in 2014, I was asked to return to U.S. government service to kind of help out with the new set of challenges that had arisen at that point. And so I've just finished 2 years working again in the Secretary of State's office, this time for former Secretary of State John Kerry, in a new office that he created called the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, which was a bit of an experimental unit that was set up in recognition of the fact that religion as a force in societies around the world seemed to be increasingly important, but religion as a factor in diplomacy was less present. That American diplomats perhaps needed to better understand religious dynamics and also needed to develop greater comfort and greater capacity to engage with religious actors and religious institutions in order to advance a wide range of U.S. policies. So I was brought in to lead a team in that office, kind of focused on the interface of religion and the challenge around Daesh, issues like sectarian conflict in Iraq and Syria. What I want to do this afternoon is to kind of reflect over a broader timeline on the question of where Islam as a topic, as a problematic, if you will, fits into U.S. foreign policy. Because it's my contention that from the time of the heart of the Cold War up until the present, U.S. foreign policy has sort of had this flip-flop, vacillating, dialectic attitude towards Islam and Islamic movements and Muslims that has sort of popped swapped back and forth between Islam and Islamic movements as partner, ally, and resource, to Islam as enemy, back to Islam as partner, resource, back to Islam as enemy. And there's this odd sort of dialectic engine that has driven this whole process that I'm sort of characterizing as a sort of ambivalence in U.S. policy. More specifically, what I think we're seeing in the aftermath of the events of 9/11, and particularly in the last few years, is something that strikes me as an even more worrying phenomenon. And you're probably going to guess that I'm going to kind of refer to the rising sense of Islamophobia in this country. It's present, and it is indeed deeply worrying. I think deeply worrying because I think it's taking on new forms, more insidious forms, and it's an industry that is well funded and that has considerable political clout behind it. And so I'm happy to, and I think we should talk about rising Islamophobia in the United States. But that's not what's most been occupying me of late, in more recent years. It's more the extent to which, in the aftermath of 9/11, Muslims have come to be constituted as objects of governance. Muslims have emerged as objects of the gaze of the state, objects to be measured, monitored, counted, polled, defined by policy in, I think, new and innovative, and I would argue, ultimately problematic ways. And I would add that this is not a partisan statement I'm making. You would maybe guess that I'm referring primarily to the policies of Republican administrations. I'm not. I think that this constitution of Muslims as an object of governance is something that the Obama administration that I served in was equally guilty of. I think it perhaps had a different intentionality behind what it was doing, but I think the effects of it were ultimately the same. And so I'll want to talk a little bit about that. But let's kind of travel back in time to start to the 1950s and 60s, the sort of good old days of the Cold War, when we knew who was who and who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. And if you were to read U.S. diplomatic cables, if you were to read the cables that our public servants sitting in embassies across, particularly the Middle East, were writing in to headquarters in Washington, you wouldn't really find much reference to Islam as a thing that factored in U.S. foreign policy. What you would mostly find are occasional references to Islamic groups and Islamic social and political movements that had been noticed by our diplomats abroad, and usually they would write in things that say, you know, these guys, these Islamic groups, they don't really like the Soviet Union very much because they see the Soviets as godless, infidel atheists. So maybe these Islamist groups would be useful for us to partner with in our grander strategic competition with the Soviet Union. So what I'm saying is that for the better part of most of the 20th century, Islam only figured in the sort of U.S. foreign policy matrix. It was only on the radar insofar as it might be useful to serve as a bulwark against communism in various mainly Muslim-majority countries. And I think it's fair to say that Islam actually enters the foreign policy lexicon as a thing unto itself in 1979 with the dramatic Islamic revolution in Iran, something that most analysts completely failed to predict, something that seemed to come out of nowhere. And of course, those set of events entered into the picture with a deeply negative valence associated with them, accompanied, of course, by television images of Ayatollah Khomeini seeming to rage against the West and the United States in particular, and the close relationship between the United States and the deposed Pahlavi dynasty in Iran. And so, Islam enters the picture, and political Islam specifically, as embodied and expressed by the Islamic Revolution, as something that is, in theory, a challenge, a threat, problematic for U.S. interests. And yet, within a few years, let's scoot our analytical lens a little further to the east, and the situation flip-flops again. And we're back into the modality of Islamic groups as useful antidotes to communism in the aftermath of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan and the rise of the Mujahideen resistance movement in that country. One that certainly did seek inspiration in and define its justice and its pathway and the legitimacy of its fight in religious terms. And so, yet again, we then find the United States entering into partnership, usually indirectly, through proxies in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, providing funding and support to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan as their battle raged with the Soviet Union. A battle that ultimately they effectively kind of won. But this moment was, as we know, an important watershed moment and a vitally important precursor moment to a set of events that would come much closer to home some years down the line. Because one element of that Mujahideen Afghan environment was the emergence of a vector of volunteer fighters leaving many countries across the Middle East, traveling to Afghanistan to fight in solidarity with the Mujahideen of that country against the Soviet Union, the so-called phenomenon of the Arab Afghans. And it's out of that experience that the nucleus of what we know today as Al-Qaeda was formed. To kind of take on the role of being a sort of roving, global, rapid reaction force that could be deployed anywhere in the world where Muslim communities were under threat or where Muslims were fighting for sovereignty or their rights as they understand them. And later, as we know, Al-Qaeda develops an important strategic shift such that it decides to start directly attacking what it understands as the sort of global sources of neo-imperialism and sort of the sort of dominant infidel powers, namely the United States and the West. So we have this constant flip-flop. The set of issues that I kind of first came into the State Department to work on have a slightly separate, but ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, related trajectory. Because when I came into the State Department, I wasn't working on the question of where, Arab Afghan volunteer militias or the Mujahideen or Al-Qaeda type groups or revolutionary movements fit into the picture. I was working on the question of how the United States should deal with political parties that define themselves in terms of Islam, that understand themselves to be operating in an Islamic framework, to be working towards the establishment of an Islamic political order, usually involving in some sense the implementation of Sharia law. What should the U.S. policy towards groups like that be? Because by the late 1980s and early 1990s, some of these parties, particularly those genealogically, if you will, linked to the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which had formerly renounced violence from the 1970s and had been working within Egyptian civil society for decades, some of these parties began to experiment with electoral politics, forming political parties and offering themselves as a choice to the electorates of their countries, with varying levels of success. But there was an event that happened in the early 1990s that set the keynote that defined U.S. policy towards movements and parties of that sort for the next few decades. And so it's important to kind of look for a moment at that event and what it represented. And the country in question is one that we, interestingly enough, don't hear too much about today, and didn't hear too much about during the Arab Uprising, and that's Algeria. It's a country that was having national elections in 1991 to form a new parliament, and over the preceding few years, at the local and provincial level, the movement and party that had been most successful was a group called the Front Islamique du Salut, the Islamic Salvation Front. This was an Islamist group that was kind of an odd hybrid, I guess, if you will, of a kind of Muslim Brotherhood inflected wing, and then another wing of the party that had a foot a little bit more squarely in, let's say, somewhat more hardline, confrontational, occasionally leaning militant politics. So it was a sort of odd alliance in the first place. But the FIS, the Front Islamique du Salut, offered itself to the country's electorate in the 1991 parliamentary elections and won a landslide. And so it looked as if we were about to, for the first time in modern history, see the rise to power of an Islamist party through the ballot box. Right? This would have been the first time that an Islamist group of movement had come to power by being voted in, rather than through an Islamic revolution or something like that. But several weeks after the election, the Algerian military stepped in, annulled the results of the election, blocked the FIS from effectively taking power, setting off a chain of events that effectively plunged that country into a civil war, for all intents and purposes, for the better part of the next decade, with dozens of thousands of people being killed. A very traumatic experience that arguably Algeria is still recovering from to this very day. But where my line of work most recently enters the story is in a speech that was given by a senior U.S. State Department official a few months after the Algerian elections were annulled. So it was a gentleman by the name of Edge Jirigian, who was then the Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs at the State Department. He was speaking at a conference in the Middle East, and in referring to the Algerian elections, he didn't do so by name. He was being very diplomatic, but everyone in the room knew what event he was talking about. He effectively said that it was probably good that the Algerian military stepped in to cancel those elections because, and this is the bumper sticker phrase, if they had not done that, then those elections would have been a case of one man, one vote, one time. One man, one vote, one time. What he's implying there was that the Islamists of Algeria were making instrumental use of the democratic system to put themselves in power, but would then likely dismantle the country's democracy so that they could never be voted out again. One man, one vote, but only one time. And I think it's fair to say that up until as recently as 2009, 2010, so for 20-some years following those events, the basic reference point for U.S. policy towards groups like the Muslim Brotherhood was this one man, one vote, one time idea. This sneaking suspicion in the back of the minds of our policymakers that these Islamist parties can't be trusted because, and I think the lingering suspicion was something like, inside they're all actually authoritarians, and so they can't be trusted with political power, because if you let them actually take control, then the totalitarian project will come out and you'll regret it. So better to just not work with them and marginalize them. And we got away with it, for the most part. The problem is that over the course of the next 20 years, these parties evolved very rapidly in a number of countries and became quite successful and savvy political operators. And in a number of countries, they established themselves as fairly normal components of the political landscape of those countries. And by normal components, I mean that they acted like, quote-unquote, normal political parties. In other words, their behavior was explainable using conventional tools of comparative political science. They would stand for parliament, and in some cases they would win, and then they'd go into parliament, and they'd do the things that parliamentarians do, make laws, form coalitions with other parties to get things done, and then every so often there'd be elections, and maybe they'd lose, and they'd say, all right, we lost, and they'd leave, and they'd, get ready to fight the next election, acting like normal political parties. And so I think by the time the Obama administration came into power, there was a realization that our approach and our thinking about these groups was probably somewhat out of date, and we needed to do something about it. And the event that caused us to do something about it is a speech that President Obama gave, which you may recall, in June 2009 in Cairo, Egypt, the famous and much vaunted Cairo speech. Characterized, its tagline was, "A new beginning with Muslim communities around the world." That tagline, I'll say, the moment I saw it, set in motion an undercurrent of nausea that has still not left me. Because it set in motion something that I think was very weird and creepy in our foreign policy thinking, and I'll get to that in a moment. But let's talk about the Obama administration for a moment and its approach to these questions. I think it's fair to say that Obama was very keen to show right out of the gates that his approach to Islam and Muslims was very different from that of George W. Bush. Obviously, the administration of G.W. Bush was most heavily associated with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and a sense of the United States at odds or in confrontation with Islam and Muslims. Despite, and I think we do have to give the former president, George W. Bush, credit for repeatedly and very clearly saying that his policy was not a policy against Islam or against Muslims, but rather something that he characterized as a global war on terror. That said, I think there are things that the George W. Bush administration did that made it very difficult for many Muslims around the world to see anything other than a more systemic criminalization of their religion and who they are. But so the Obama folks, right from the beginning, tried to signal that they're going to do things differently. So in Obama's inaugural speech in January 2009, 18 minutes in, we get a U.S. president talking about the idea of the need to repair fences, to mend relations with Muslims around the world. The first time in the history of a presidential speech that Muslims had been mentioned as a category, as an object, something that the United States was focused on. And we get a clear sense of what this shift is going to look like a few months later when he's speaking in front of the National Assembly in Ankara, in Turkey. And he gives a speech that's kind of mainly about U.S. security policy and the importance of the U.S.-Turkish relationship. But towards the end of the speech, he does this kind of move where he says, also, I want to say today that going forward, U.S. relations with Muslim communities around the world will stop being about security and terrorism and will instead start to be about cooperation and partnership and working together towards shared interests. So it's this kind of we're going to make nice with the global Muslims kind of theme that starts to emerge. And it gets its most detailed and full-throated articulation a couple months later in this Cairo speech, where the president begins by laying out what appears to his audience an incredibly ambitious but very welcome set of claims about the need to normalize relations with Iran as much as possible, take seriously solving the Israel-Palestine conflict, with the United States playing a more even-handed role, taking seriously the idea of democracy in the Middle East. And that's a gutsy thing to say, sitting in Egypt with the president of Egypt in the front row, one of the most adamant authoritarians in the region. So So he lays out this audacious set of claims. And then the second half of the speech kind of is the human development phase of the speech. And he talks about, for example, the need to empower women around the world, the importance of science and technology, education, entrepreneurship, just, things that will improve the quality of life for people. Rapturous applause. Everyone loves it. The dude gets given the Nobel Peace Prize for that speech. Doesn't actually do any of it. But I think the world was so waiting for an American leader to show the way to something very different that the Nobel Committee just got kind of excited rather quickly. So what happens in the aftermath of this Cairo speech? Well, we start doing some things that, to my mind, are kind of strange. We appoint at the U.S. State Department a position whose title is Special Representative to Muslim Communities. This is bizarre. You should think that's very strange, because it is. Never in the history of U.S. foreign policy and diplomacy have we ever had anyone appointed to be the envoy to a world religion of 1.6 billion people. No other world religion has a special envoy at the State Department, but the Muslims have one. What does that mean? What does it mean to be the envoy to Muslims? What's weird about it is that it's at some level a bizarre refocusing of U.S. foreign policy. Because the usual way that the United States and its foreign policy regards non-U.S. peoples is through their citizenship of other sovereign nation states with which we have diplomatic relations. Because, of course, these global Muslim communities that they're very excited about, these people are also Senegalese, Jordanians, Indonesians, Kazakhs. They're all citizens of one country or another. There's any number of ways we might refer to them. Through gender, through nationality, through ethnicity, through race, through profession. But for some reason, the Obama administration is very excited about their Muslimness. And what we begin to do, I contend, is we begin to reify religious identity in a way that leads us to project, ascribe, and at times overly emphasize the Muslimness of Muslims in ways that, again, I would argue, are ultimately harmful to U.S. foreign policy. You're basically telling people who maybe, yes, at some level would identify as Muslim, that in the eyes of the United States, the thing that most matters to Washington, D.C. is your religious identity. I want to deal with you on the basis of your Muslimness. And the Obama administration requests $100 million in fiscal year 2011 for what it calls global engagement programs. And these global engagement programs, that's a shorthand for Muslim programs. So we're going to have $100 million of Muslim programming. We're going to start appointing officials who are the envoys to Muslims. And over the course of the year following the Cairo speech, there is born in Washington, D.C., a global Muslim engagement industry, effectively. It becomes the hot, cool thing to do for about a year between 2009 and 2011. Hollywood, Wall Street get in the picture. All the movie stars are all kind of head up about, oh my God, engaging with Muslims is so awesome. I engage with so many Muslims. CEOs of Wall Street firms are committing funds to Partners for a New Beginning, an innovative entrepreneurship platform that will build small business capacity throughout the Muslim world. But the Muslim world and Muslims are not an actionable and relevant category for U.S. foreign policy. And I would contend that we were doing something problematic at multiple levels in overly focusing on the Muslimness of Muslims around the world. One I've already mentioned is this idea that you're forcing someone to be defined, to present themselves in front of the state through exclusive reference to their religious identity. you're forcing them to identify in religious terms at some level. And we know that there was some disquiet about this, because when some of these entrepreneurship programs started being run, some of the participants from countries like Indonesia and Turkey would come to the State Department people running these programs on the sidelines of the conferences and say, look, we really like the substance of the work, but can we drop the Muslim thing? Can you stop referring to us as Muslim entrepreneurs? We're just entrepreneurs. Our religious identity has nothing to do with this. And yet, I think in the eyes of many of my colleagues at the time in the State Department, this seemed okay. This seemed natural. This seemed normal, even good. And so I would try to say to them, look, USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, runs small business development programs in Ecuador, right? Yeah, we do that. The vast majority of the citizens of Ecuador are Christian, right? Yes. If we called those programs Christian engagement, wouldn't that be weird? Yeah, it would. Well, why is it any less weird to call this stuff in Indonesia and Turkey Muslim engagement? Well, it's different. It's not different. Because if you say that it's different, you're making a deeper claim about Islam and Muslimness that we need to explore. It suggests that there's something else going on in your assumptions about the importance of religious identity to Muslims versus the ways in which Christian identity and Christianity manifests itself in the identities and socio-political consciousness, say, of Christians around the world. Now, I would try and make this point till I was blue in the face in the State Department, and a lot of it was just fighting an uphill bureaucratic battle because, well, frankly, there was $100 million behind it, and the bureaucracy likes money. So even if people would agree with my critique, they'd be like, dude, you're right, but $100 million, I want a piece of that, so I'm happy to do Muslim engagement programs. So I thought, all right, I've got to find a different frame for my critique. And I thought I came upon something pretty brilliant. Because usually if you make your argument on the grounds of national security, then that's a winning argument. So I said, it is bad for U.S. national security for us to do all this Muslim engagement and have these Muslim envoys and have Muslim programs. Because by doing so, we are effectively validating the narrative of groups like Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Because in their view of things, the Muslimness of these Muslims is the most important thing. They are first and foremost part of a transnational ummah, a community of believers. That's the most relevant reference point for them, much more so than their individual nation-state identities and citizenship. Right? The project of Al-Qaeda is to disconnect people from those nation-state identities and make them feel like they're part of a sort of transnational Islamist solidarity movement. And my argument was that by describing this work and talking about it in terms of global Muslim outreach, we were at some level validating the discourse of Al-Qaeda. And I think the National Security Council thought that my paper was a very interesting thing to read, and they put it aside. $100 million, you can say. So I realized eventually that the only way I could stop this was to shut off the $100 million. And it's probably my greatest bureaucratic victory is that I did manage to shut off all but $1.3 million. I got it diverted to other stuff. Because this was the great lesson for me, is that I could make the policy arguments till I was blue in the face, but bureaucracies are driven by other kinds of currency, and in many cases literally currency. And so you've got to find other ways to adapt to it. Thankfully, this Muslim engagement in industry wore itself out by about 2012, 2013, because by that point the Cairo speech, no one remembered it anymore. Much more dramatic things had happened in Cairo by that point. We were in the aftermath of the Arab Uprisings, the Syrian civil war, and then very soon the rise of ISIS. And that's when we have to kind of come a little bit back closer to home in order to kind of round up our last sprint to the present day and me shutting up so that we can have some discussion of these topics. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, there certainly was an initial upsurge in Islamophobia in the sense of people having increased suspicion towards Muslims as potential security risks, i.e. as people who might blow something up. I myself personally was very hardened on this campus. I noted, I've been teaching this class on political Islam for the last 20 years in one form or another, and I've been teaching it since I started working here in 2000, and my class size tripled the semester after 9/11. And I was very worried, and on the first day of class I said, look, if you're here because you think this is a class on terrorism, it's not. And I was being overly defensive because what I was very heartened to discover is that most of the students in the class were just like, no, we're not here to learn about terrorism. We're just suddenly aware of Islam and we don't know anything about Islam, and so we're here to learn. And that was very heartening to see. That said, there was this upsurge in Islamophobia, as I said, in the sense of Muslims perceived as a direct security threat. What's worried me, I think, is, however, the related but also parallel rise, particularly within the political right and the far political right of this country, from the mid-2000s onward, of an industry of anti-Muslim sentiment that is not arguing simply that there's a heightened risk that Muslims are terrorists, but arguing that the religion of Islam itself, its beliefs, its teachings, are antithetical to American values, and that there is some inherent civilizational conflict between, quote-unquote, our way of life and Islam. And this began as a fairly fringe thing, but it also began to make political headway. And at a certain point, and this to me is one of the greatest crying shames in American politics, and it's a story of how the Republican Party in this country lost Muslim voters. Because prior to 9/11, there is some considerable evidence to suggest that many Muslims in this country voted for the Republican Party, which is not difficult to understand. Many Muslims in this country are socially conservative and fiscally conservative and pro-business. So who would you vote for? Republicans. But because the Republican administration after 9/11 was perceived to have gone on this sort of anti-Islamic bender with these wars and the sort of giving the space for the rise of Islamophobia, Muslim Americans, by and large, stopped voting Republican. And to me, the saddest story, in a sense, is that even though to this day, I would contend that many Muslim Americans are just as, if not more comfortable in terms of their beliefs and values in the Republican Party has made it impossible for them to live there, because the Republican Party has made the calculation that there is greater political currency to be gained in their broader constituency on the right to marginalize and create a sense of suspicion with respect to Muslims. So this Islamophobia industry begins, it grows in prominence in certain quadrants of the political right, and this kind of brings us up to where we are today, which is a situation where I think many Muslims in this country are feeling deeply unsettled. And not just because of the sudden rise of Islamophobia, they know it's been there in one form or another for at least 15 years or more, but the fact that the current president has around him, as some of his closest advisors, a set of figures that hold views that until recently were incredibly fringe views. This idea of Islam as a civilizational threat to the United States, and these people are now sitting in the White House one or two doors down from the Oval Office. This on the back, of course, of a presidential campaign in which the president, then candidate, said openly that banning Muslims from entering the United States was going to be something they were going to do. Talk of a Muslim registry of some sort. And now, of course, we have some of the early actions with respect to restrictions on immigration and refugees. And I think a situation where a lot of Muslims in this country are wondering whether, under the current administration, there's a place for them in their own nation, whether they're still welcome here. And so where I'm at is, having spent several years working in administration that was, on the one hand, doing things that I thought were very important, which was to figure out how to right-size and normalize its relations with Islamist political parties in the Middle East and elsewhere in the Muslim world. I'm happy to talk about how we approach that. I realize I didn't talk so much about it just because I think there's more imperative issues staring us in the face right now that we needed to get into. So on the one hand, we're sort of doing this normalization of relations with mainstream Islamist movements and political parties, and yet on the other hand, the Obama administration, and I know that it did not mean to do this, because I had this conversation with people like Ben Rhodes and people in the White House who were directly responsible for kind of creating this whole frame. There wasn't this desire to kind of single out and shine a light on the Muslimness. But the problem is that by creating this idea of the need to engage with Muslims and make nice with Muslims around the world, the Obama administration was at some level reproducing the idea that there's something exceptional and different about Muslims that mean that they have to be treated differently than other religious groups. To my mind, if you're trying to normalize relations with a particular group after some years of rocky roads and difficult relations, you would normalize relations by treating them the way you treat everyone else. But no, the Obama administration, I think largely in a PR exercise, but I think one whose logic was deeply flawed, thought that it's important to kind of celebrate and shine a light on and try and tell nice, cuddly, warm partnership and co-productive stories about how we're going to do all these wonderful entrepreneurship and science and education programs with Muslims around the world. And so here we are now in this cycle, back to a place where the U.S. foreign policy view of Islam seems to have flip-flopped fairly firmly back into the risk-threat category. I know many of my colleagues that I served with in the Obama administration feel that a lot of the work that we did over the last 8 years, a lot of it has been undone in just a few weeks. And, that's not particularly encouraging to see. If there's a silver lining in all of this, I think it's in the fact that you're starting to see alliances and partnerships within the United States between different groups emerge that just weren't really possible before. Muslim civil rights activists reaching out to Black Lives Matter. American Muslim and American Jewish communities looking at each other and seeing communities of a shared fate right now and saying, we need to work together. Because the rise of anti-Semitism enabled by people like Steve Bannon in the White House and the alt-right and the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment are two sides of the same coin. And so I think what we're seeing is the opening of the possibility of alliances and activism across communities that previously weren't talking to each other. And I think just for the sake of our democracy, that's a good thing to see. I'll end on that bittersweet note. I don't have a nice, inspiring, encouraging thing to say at the end of all this. But thank you for the opportunity to kind of reflect on and vent a little bit of spleen about things that I worked on over the last few years, and grateful for the opportunity to hear your thoughts and reactions and questions. Thank you very much.